who celebrates a wedding when the bride is already a victim, in the heart of Renaissance Rome. The Vatican's bells rang as if heralding a holy triumph. The great hall glowed with candlelight, gold leaf glinting from every arch, and the air was thick with the perfume of roses. Nobles in brocade lined the marble aisle, their eyes fixed on a vision in white. Lucrezia Borgia moved forward in measured steps, her gown a river of silk, her veil trailing like captured moonlight. At her side walked the man who had already claimed her in the most brutal way, a shadow behind his smile, the unspoken truth woven into every stitch of this spectacle. Music floated from the gallery, lutes and viols in perfect harmony, masking the unease that clung to the air. Courtiers leaned in to murmur blessings, their jewels catching the light like tiny flames, while the Pope himself looked on with a gaze carved from stone. Yet the bride's eyes told another story. They were not the eyes of a woman walking toward a shared future, but of one bound to a sentence. How could the daughter of the most powerful man in Christendom be given to the man who had destroyed her? And why did the city watch in silence? The answer was not in the vows or the gold, but in the corridors of power where sins could be sanctified if they served ambition. As she left the altar, the long train of her veil swept across the cold marble, catching a thin smear of red. It clung there like a seal of fate, a mark that would follow her into legend. Stay with us, because this is not just the story of a marriage. It is the story of a curse. Subscribe now, so you do not miss the truths that history tried to bury. In the closing years of the 15th century, Rome was not merely a city. It was the beating heart of Christendom, a stage where power was cloaked in silk and anointed with incense. Yet behind the grandeur of its basilicas and the solemn chants of its choirs, an intricate web of ambition stretched across every marble corridor. At the center of this web was the Borgia family, a name that could inspire both reverence and dread in equal measure. Rodrigo Borgia, who ascended to the papal throne as Alexander VI, embodied the paradox of the age. As Pope, he was the spiritual leader of millions. As a man, he was a master of political maneuver, unafraid to use his office to secure the fortunes of his bloodline. His court was a theater of calculated alliances, where marriages were as valuable as military victories. Every union was a treaty, every child a potential key to another kingdom. Beside him stood Cesare Borgia, Lucrezia's elder brother, a figure as brilliant in strategy as he was feared in temperament. Cesare had exchanged the crimson robes of a cardinal for the steel of a condottiero, carving territories through Italy with a precision that rivaled any general of his time. Together, father and son envisioned a Borgia dominion that would bind the fragmented states of the peninsula under their influence. Lucrezia, young, beautiful, and of impeccable lineage, was more than a daughter or sister. She was a living piece on this board of power, her hand in marriage a weapon that could forge or break alliances. One suitor might bring military strength, another the wealth of trade, and another yet the favor of a neighboring duchy. Her future was plotted not in the language of love, but in the language of conquest. Rome in this era was a crucible of intrigue. Cardinals whispered in candlelit chapels, envoys arrived in the dead of night, and the streets outside the Vatican teemed with mercenaries and spies. Assassinations were not rare scandals but familiar instruments of diplomacy, their victims disappearing beneath the cobblestones as quickly as treaties were signed. In such a climate, a wedding could alter the balance of power as surely as a victory on the battlefield. For the Borgias, every celebration carried the weight of strategy. Lucrezia's marriages were not private unions, but public declarations, each one designed to tighten the family's grip on Italy's fragile map. And in this game, hesitation meant weakness, and weakness was fatal. The corridors of the Vatican could feel like a labyrinth built not from stone, but from secrets. That night, the marble floors reflected the faint glow of torches, and the air held the stillness of a church after midnight. Lucrezia had been summoned under the pretense of a private conversation, a matter her family insisted could not wait until morning. The door closed behind her with the quiet finality of a verdict. In the chamber, the air was warm with candlelight. Then, one by one, the flames dimmed as shadows grew tall across the walls. A latch turned. The iron sound of a lock sliding into place seemed to echo louder than any voice. In that instant, the room came smaller, its air heavier, as if the walls themselves were leaning closer. The candles flickered, then gave way to darkness, leaving only the faint outline of a figure moving forward. What happened next was not spoken of in Rome's halls, but it imprinted itself into her mind with the permanence of a scar carved in marble. When the door opened again, the light returned, but the world did not. She walked out into the dining hall, where the Pope and his cardinals sat among silver goblets and platters of roasted meat. Her seat was waiting, her cup already poured. The clamor of conversation filled the space, but to her it was only the muffled roar of the Tiber in flood, drowning out her thoughts. She took her place, folded her hands, and kept her eyes fixed on the table before her. Not a single guest looked at her with suspicion. Not a single word acknowledged her absence. In the days that followed, the incident dissolved into silence. No servants whispered of it in the kitchens. No courtiers risked a sideways glance. It was as if a cord had been pulled, drawing a curtain over the memory. Rome's nobility knew the cost of speaking certain truths. The Vatican, a place where sins could be confessed, became instead a fortress where certain sins were locked away, their existence denied by the very people who had the power to punish them. For Lucrezia, the silence was its own form of captivity. She was forced to walk through gilded halls as if nothing had happened, to greet ambassadors and attend feasts with the same grace expected of a pope's daughter. Each smile she offered was a piece of armor, each word a carefully measured step to avoid the fissures in her own composure. The secret was no longer only hers. It belonged to everyone in the room that night, and yet to no one at all. It became part of the architecture, embedded in the marble floors and the painted ceilings, a ghost that moved silently between the pillars. And as it settled into history, it was not recorded in ink or parchment, but in the unbroken quiet that followed, as if the act had never occurred. The wedding day dawned with the kind of brilliance Rome reserved for holy festivals. Bells rang from the highest towers, their peals cascading over the city like a proclamation of triumph. The streets near the Vatican were lined with banners in the papal colors, and the scent of incense drifted from every chapel. It was meant to be a day of joy, of unity, of divine blessing. Yet for those who knew the truth, the splendor was a mask stretched tightly over something far darker. The hall of the ceremony was a vision of excess. Gold leaf clung to every arch. Frescoes of saints gazed down from the vaulted ceilings, and carpets from the east softened each step. Musicians in embroidered doublets lined the side aisles, their instruments ready to weave a canopy of sound over the proceedings. The guests, a tapestry of Europe's nobility, murmured greetings and adjusted their jeweled collars, oblivious or unwilling to see the undercurrent that ran beneath the pageantry. At the altar stood the man who had taken so much from Lucrezia before this day. His expression was crafted for the crowd, a blend of solemn dignity and restrained pride. When she entered, the music swelled, drowning out the faint sound of her footsteps. Her gown was a masterpiece of the age, heavy with pearls and edged in gold thread, the veil cascading down like a waterfall of light. Every detail was perfect. But perfection here was not beauty. It was an offering, the kind laid upon an altar before a sacrifice. The Pope, her father, presided over the union with the gravity of a man uniting two realms. His eyes, sharp and unreadable, moved between bride and groom as if ensuring the transaction was proceeding according to plan. Around him, the College of Cardinals sat in crimson robes, their silence as heavy as the incense-laden air. Not one voice rose in protest, not one face betrayed discomfort. This was not a wedding in the eyes of God, but a covenant in the service of power. When the vows were spoken, the words floated above the assembly like smoke, sweet on the surface, poisonous underneath. Each promise was hollow, its edges sharpened by the knowledge of what had already passed. To the guests, they were symbols of alliance. To Lucrezia, they were chains being fastened in full view of the world. The music carried on, rich and unbroken, yet beneath it was another rhythm, slow and relentless. It was the sound of her own heartbeat, pressing in her ears, marking the moments until the ceremony's end. Every note of the lutes and viols seemed to mock that inner pulse, as if the beauty of the day existed only to smother the truth. When it was done, and the blessing given, the applause of the court rose like a wave. Lucrezia turned, her face composed, her steps measured, but in her chest the weight of the vows sat like a stone. This was not the beginning of a marriage. It was the public sealing of a fate decided long before she walked down that aisle. The first marriage that bound Lucrezia to power ended almost as abruptly as it had begun. Her union with Giovanni Sforza, Lord of Pesaro, had been arranged to cement an alliance between the Borgias and the influential Sforza family. At first, the match appeared politically sound, yet whispers soon began to stir in the corridors of Rome. The Pope and Cesare, ever calculating, saw new opportunities elsewhere, and Giovanni's usefulness began to fade. In a move as cold as it was calculated, the marriage was annulled. Officially, the claim was non-consummation, a statement that humiliated Giovanni and severed ties in a single stroke. It was during this time that the first murmurs of a curse began to circulate, not in the courts of power, but in the marketplaces, among the servants and stable boys. They said any man who wed Lucrezia would find himself stripped of more than titles. Some said it was vengeance from the heavens for sins committed in secret. Others whispered that the curse was not divine at all, but born of mortal hands within the Vatican itself. Her second marriage was to Alfonso of Aragon, Duke of Bisceglie, a man whose charm and youth seemed to promise a fresh chapter. This union was more than personal. It was meant to strengthen the papal ties with the Kingdom of Naples. For a brief season, there were glimpses of genuine affection between them, moments when Lucrezia's guarded smile softened. Yet, in the shadows, Cesare's political ambitions shifted again. Alfonso was attacked on the steps of St. Peter's and left bleeding. He survived the first attempt, only to be strangled weeks later in his own chamber. Official accounts were muted, but few doubted whose orders had brought about his end. The curse was spoken of more boldly now, not in hushed tones, but as a warning. Her third marriage was to Alfonso I d'Este, Duke of Ferrara. This was the most stable and enduring of her unions, forged as a bridge between two powerful houses. Lucrezia grew into her role as Duchess with dignity, overseeing courtly affairs, patronizing the arts, and earning respect in Ferrara. Yet even here, the shadows of her past trailed her. Enemies of the Borgias spread rumors, reviving the old accusations of poison and betrayal, weaving them into tales of the curse that clung to her name. While Alfonso lived, the duchy prospered, but the undercurrent of suspicion never fully left. As the years passed, the curse became part of her legend. It was embroidered into songs, told in taverns far from Rome, and repeated by those who had never seen her face. The pattern was too neat for those who craved superstition: the first husband humiliated, the second murdered, and the third living under a cloud of doubt. It was as if fate itself conspired to remind her that every alliance forged through her hand would end in loss. Lucrezia herself gave no public credence to such talk, yet in the quiet hours, away from courtly duties, she must have felt the weight of the pattern. Each ring placed upon her finger was not only a token of union, but a reminder of the graves and broken thrones left behind. The curse, whether real or imagined, became part of her identity, a shadow cast across the marble floors of every palace she entered. By the time Lucrezia Borgia was firmly established in Ferrara, her name had already taken on a life of its own beyond the city walls. In the courts of her family's enemies, she was no longer merely the daughter of a pope or the wife of a duke. She had become a character in a darker narrative, crafted with deliberate malice. The rumors painted her as a femme fatale of Renaissance legend, a woman whose beauty masked a venomous core. They claimed she carried poison hidden in jeweled rings, ready to pour it into a lover's cup. They whispered that her closest confidant was her brother Cesare, and that their bond crossed lines the church itself would not dare acknowledge. These stories traveled faster than any ambassador could ride. Merchants repeated them in marketplaces. Poets wove them into verses meant to entertain noble patrons. Foreign envoys carried them back to their own courts, where the name Lucrezia became shorthand for danger draped in silk. The Borgia enemies, particularly in rival Italian states and in factions within the Vatican, had every reason to keep these stories alive. To tarnish her was to tarnish the family's alliances, and in the turbulent chessboard of Renaissance politics, reputation could be as lethal as any blade. Yet when historians attempt to peel away the layers of gossip, the portrait shifts. Contemporary accounts from Ferrara describe a duchess devoted to her children, respected for her ability to manage court affairs, and admired for her patronage of artists and writers. Correspondence between Lucrezia and her husband Alfonso I d'Este reveals a marriage marked more by partnership than intrigue. Even diplomatic reports from foreign ambassadors, though sometimes colored by bias, do not consistently support the most sensational claims. The contradictions are stark. On one hand, chronicles from hostile sources depict her as an architect of murder, a seductress who used love as a lure to destroy. On the other, the city she ruled remembered her as a stabilizing force, a patroness who enriched Ferrara's culture. The gap between these images speaks less to her true nature and more to the power of narrative in an age when truth was pliable in the hands of those who controlled the ink and parchment. Some of the most infamous tales, like the alleged incest with Cesare or the use of the legendary Borgia poison, remain unsubstantiated by concrete evidence. They persist because they serve the timeless appetite for scandal. In a world where political rivalry often played out in pamphlets and private letters, a lie repeated often enough could be remembered as history. This tension between fact and fabrication leaves her legacy suspended in uncertainty. Was she truly the venomous woman of legend, or was she a casualty of propaganda? Her image sharpened into a weapon by those who sought to wound the Borgias. The answer lies not in a single source, but in the uneasy overlap between the chronicler's pen and the storyteller's imagination. The winters in Ferrara grew quieter as Lucrezia moved into her middle years. The gardens she had once walked in spring bloom now stood bare, their fountains stilled under a thin crust of frost. Within the walls of the ducal palace, the tapestries muted the chill, and the corridors carried the soft murmur of attendants and the distant echo of the chapel's bells. Her children moved through these halls with the ease of those who had never known Rome's dangerous currents. To them, she was not a pawn, not a rumor, but a mother and a duchess whose counsel carried weight. Her duties remained steady. She mediated disputes between court factions, oversaw charitable works for the convents, and hosted gatherings that brought poets and musicians into Ferrara's orbit. Yet there were evenings when she withdrew to her private chambers, the candlelight tracing the lines time had drawn upon her face. Outside her windows, the city settled into the rhythm of the night, its streets silvered by moonlight, its people unaware of how many lives had been shaped by the silent decisions she had borne. The world beyond Ferrara still spoke her name in two voices. One belonged to the city that cherished her as a capable duchess, the other to the faraway courts that clung to their tales of poison and scandal. Here, in her final years, she no longer tried to reconcile them. Life had taught her that history rarely offered the truth untainted. In the summer of 1519, illness came quietly. It was not the swift violence that had taken so many around her, but a gradual fading. She spent her last days in the convent of Corpus Domini, the air heavy with incense and the low chanting of nuns. When the end came, it was marked not by the roar of politics, but by the stillness of a city in mourning. The bells tolled, their sound rolling over Ferrara like a final benediction. She was buried in the convent she had supported, her tomb modest compared to the grandeur of her youth. Yet even in death, the name she carried remained heavy, bound to stories that would outlive those who told them. She was a duchess respected by her people, but also a woman whose life had been shaped, constrained, and ultimately defined by the ambitions of others. If a throne can turn a girl into a tool, it can also swallow the memory of an entire life. Stay with us, for the stories to come will show you that the price of power has never been paid in gold, but always in blood.